Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's talk, to the book launch of Daniel Tödts' book, The Lumumba Generation, African Bourgeoisie and Colonial Distinction in the Belgian Congo. This has just been published and is another publication in our series, Africa in Global History. I'll briefly start introducing tonight's event. I'll be as brief as possible because the actual interesting things are happening after I shut up. But what's important for all of you to know is that this is going to be recorded. So just to be on the safe side here legally, I have to say that. But yeah, now without further ado, I'll jump right in. Maybe by explaining a little bit how this all came about. Like I said, this is one of the first publications of the book series, which is called Africa in Global History. And the idea to start such a book series is a bit, well, it's not that old, but it's also not that current. So we started talking and thinking about it in 2018, in the summer of 2018, actually. And it had started because I worked at Rework quite a while back, the venue of tonight's hybrid event. And it's impossible to work at Rework without getting introduced into the world of African history, because there are just so many phenomenal African studies people, African historians working there. And it sucks you in, and it opens up a whole new world. It did to me. So since I left, I never stopped thinking about how to incorporate African history into my work. And that's why I started reaching out to African history scholars and to people working on African studies and African history in the first place. And I initially talked to Christine White at the University of Glasgow about first ideas about how to make such a series into a reality, and how to make a series about Africa that actually focuses on Africa, but still in the global scheme. And we talked about it. We had a wonderful conversation about it, and afterwards followed lots and lots and lots of phone calls and emails with Joël Glasman, who's also here with us tonight in the role of a moderator, Alexander Käse, who I haven't seen in the audience, but nevertheless is also one of the series editors, and Omar Gueye. And yeah, we all came to the conclusion that a series about Africa and global history, Africa in global history, is badly needed, and hence we started it. And it took a bit of time to get the first publication out, but it happened last year, and we are extremely proud of it. And we're especially proud of Daniel's book, of course, which was originally published in German and was translated with the help of the Börsenverein, especially thanks to Anke Simon, who I hope is among the audience with us tonight, and the translator, of course, who did an amazing job translating the book into English, Alexander Skinner. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say about how the series started in the first place and who contributed to the ideas. And like I said, the working with the series editors, Christine, Joël, Alexander, and Omar, is wonderful, always easy and always fun, and I couldn't possibly wish for a better team to work on that. and also couldn't be prouder to talk about any other book than Daniel's book tonight. Since Joël will now lead through most of the evening, I'll end my introduction with his. So I'll introduce Joël. Is a professor in African history at the University of Bayreuth. Like I said, one of the series editors, and he's working methodologically at the intersection of history, science, and technology studies, and has recently published a book called Minimal Humanity, Humanitarianism and the Quantification of Human Needs, with Routledge. And I think it's, the focus of his work is Francophone West and Central Africa. And with that, I hand over to you, Joël.
Thanks, Rabia. It isn't something that happens to me all that often, having to review a book that I wish I had written myself. This is how Marc de Pape, professor at the University of Leuven, starts his review of Daniel Tödts' book. And I don't know how many colleagues and friends in the public tonight are on the same side, who will have wish to write this book themselves. But I think that's a nice compliment to do to a book. So good evening also from my side, everybody. I'm very happy to be here, and thanks for our speakers to be here to launch Daniel's book, The Lumumba Generation, African Bourgeoisie and Colonial Distinction in the Belgian Congo. This is, as Rabia said, the 5th volume of the new series, Africa in Global History series, that has been initiated by Rabia Redgeroth and Christine White, and that is now edited by Omar Gay, Alexander Kese, Christine White, and myself. And the idea was very much to bridge the gap between the global history on one side and African history on the other side. Of course, the field of global history is mature. It has its journals, it has networks, it has master's degrees, countless publications, but it still fails to a certain extent to acknowledge fully the diversity of local and regional experiences. And much of global history still focuses on the Northern Atlantic world. Of course, it doesn't mean that the African experiences are absent from global history, but if you look at some of the bestsellers in the field, there's still a need to fully take African experiences into account. There are some good surprises, of course, in recent years with Toby Green, with Howard French, with a couple of others. But we still need solid monographs that have an interest for global historical perspective, and this is what the series tries to do. We had Marie Huber on developing heritage in Ethiopia, Eric Burton, Anne Dietrich, Emmanuel Harish, and Marcia Schenk on navigating socialist encounters, Benoît Henriet of colonial importance in Congo, and Jeffrey Gunn on outsourcing African labor, crew migratory workers in global ports, estates, and battlefields, and now Daniel Tödts' book on Congolese elites and decolonization. This book is, of course, a significant addition to the series. It's the translation of the German version that has been published under the title Elitenbildung und Dekolonisierung, die Evolue in Belgisch Congo. And the historians who reviewed that book were anonymous about the quality of the book. Guy van Temsche, writes of Daniel great craftsmanship, and Christian Hadon finds the book a crucial contribution to the social history of educated Africans. And Christine Rütter writes that this is an excellent book, and Christine Rütter was obviously surprised that a manuscript that qualifies for a German PhD in a German university could be, I quote, an extremely readable book. And of course, the Geisteswissenschaften Prize, International Prize for an outstanding work in the humanities, speaks of a groundbreaking and finally crafted and absolute pleasure to read. And several reviewers asked for an English translation, and this is now work done thanks to the work of Daniel, of Alex Skinner, the translator, and Rabea's work. I shortly introduce our speakers for this evening. Ngozi Edeagu is a PhD candidate in African history at the University of Bayreuth. She's doing her PhD on writing back to the empire, newspapers, non-elites, and decolonization in the global public sphere. Prior to that, she was a lecturer at the Department of History and Strategic Studies at Alex Ekwueme Federal University in Ikwo, Nigeria. And her last publication includes Negotiating Patriarchy and Gender in Africa, Discourses, Practices, and Policies. Emery Kalema is a postdoctoral researcher in the project Herical. He's working at the Free University in Brussels on the history of African students going to the Free University. He has published on the Mulele Rebellion in post-colonial Congo, among which a recent article, the Mulele Rebellion, Bodily Pain and the Politics of Death in the Democratic Republic of Congo, published with Politique Africaine. Richard Drayton is a professor of imperial and global history at the King's College in London. He is currently a visiting fellow at the Global History Group at the Free University in Berlin, and a reception of the Humboldt Research Awards. He's working on a project entitled Europe's Hinterland and its Blue Water Empires. I will spare you the long list of Richard's publication. That will take a long time, but I will just quote one very relevant to tonight's discussion. Race, Class, Culture and Class, European Hegemony and Global Class Formation, an article published in journal Jürgen Hosterhamel, Christoph de Jong and David Mortadel's edited volume on the global bourgeoisie, to which Daniel's book speak. Daniel Tödts, last but not least, is currently a lecturer at the chair of African history at the Humboldt University. Daniel started, as you may know, his career writing a book about hip hop and rap music in an urban culture in Marseille, and then turned to African history with his PhD on the history of Congolese elites. And after his book has turned his efforts towards an history of imperial ports and what he calls second imperial cities. So thank you very much to all the speakers for being here. We will ask Daniel to give us a short insight on the book, and then we'll listen to the commentaries.
Yeah, thank you very much for these extremely kind words. It so far feels a bit like attending the annual meeting of the Communist Party with so much praises, and I hope that some comments also point out weaknesses of this book. Just to start, it's really an honor now to present this book to you today. And first of all, this book would have never seen the light of day without the help and support of so many individuals. And I'm extremely happy to see that many of them are here joining us tonight. So I just take this opportunity to say thank you, merci beaucoup, matondo mingi, dankjewel, and vielen Dank. And first, I start with a few words on the making of this book. In 2009, Andreas Eckert hired me to conduct the research at the Humboldt University Berlin. And the aim was to compare African elite culture in the Belgian Congo and the Gold Coast. At one point of time, however, I decided to focus on the Congo only. And today, once again, I'm much hoping that Andreas won't ask me about the fate of the second part of this project. But as it was already said, the Lumumba Generation is the revised and also translated version of my dissertation which was published 3 years ago. So this is the book cover in German. It's not open access, so go with the English translation. And this translation was possible as it was set by the award of Geisteswissenschaften International Prize by the German Publishers and Booksellers Association. And both the revision of the book and its translation took place during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Lockdowns with online teaching and also homeschooling made it a rather challenging endeavor. And the fact that it worked out is to a great extent down to my beloved family, and also to Alex Skinner, who is joining us from Costa Rica tonight, who produced really in a translation with friendliness and great professionalism. So thanks also for your great work. And today I'm extremely excited, of course, that finally my research results are accessible to the international readership. And I'm extremely excited to hear also what you think about it, who joined on Zoom, but also what the panelists have to say. And the panelists, they are scholars who were involved in the making of this book in different ways. So let me start with Ngozi Edeagu. This summer term, he intervened in an MA class that I taught on African print media. And her research on how non-elite voices shaped the discussion on decolonization in West African newspapers made me aware also of the blind spots that come with the elite-focused approach of my book. And when I invited Emery Kalema as an expert on Congolese history, I didn't know that we have already met in 2010 at the University of Kinshasa, when I desperately tried to find Professor Jean-Marie Mutamba Makombo. His illuminating book was the first comprehensive study on the Evolué, and I knew that I could only get a copy of this book in his house. And a young history student of the Unikin was so kind to show me the way, and last week it turned out that this guy was Emery Kalema. And Richard Drayton, he was already intellectually around me when I revised my book last year. More precisely, it was his chapter in the already mentioned volume on the global bourgeoisie, where he discussed the intersections of race, culture, and class that inspired me. Now, some final words on the book itself. Joël gave me only 5 minutes in total, so please excuse me this rather brief elevator pitch. Most of you remember the speeches held on 30 June 1960, the Congo's Independence Day. First, King Baudouin glorified independence as the crowning achievement of Belgium's brilliant plan to develop the colony. Then, the newly elected Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba starkly reckoned with Belgian colonialism, praising the resistance of the Congolese people. These contrary narratives are reflected in two major trends of historiography on decolonization. The first focuses on the anti-colonial struggle. The second highlights European politicians who implemented plans for an orderly transfer of power. But neither of these narratives bears up against the complex happenings in the Congo. In the first few months after independence, violent events led to the so-called Congo crisis. And when Lumumba was murdered, he entered the history books as a global icon of the independence struggle. Lumumba's life story, however, complicates the brief narrative of an anti-colonial fighter. In a sense, the historical figure of Lumumba oscillates between the two seemingly opposing poles articulated in the Independence Day speeches. Lumumba himself had sung the praises of the Belgian civilizing mission some years before, yet he was by no means an opportunistic turncoat. His personal history says little about Lumumba as a person and much more about the social formation to which he belonged, the so-called Evolué. This metamorphosis is representative of a generation of Congolese for whom there was no contradiction in first serving the colonial state, as most of them did, and then defeating and finally inheriting it. The Evolué undermined the foundations of the colonial order, not despite, but precisely because of their close collaboration with the colonial state. Like Lumumba, other members of government were part of this elite. And like him, many of them worked in the colonial administration, were active as association presidents and journalists, and had attained a special legal status through the demonstrative display of a bourgeois lifestyle. Yet, their calls for greater participation in political and social life, for greater recognition and equality, were met only to a highly limited degree by the colonial state. In the logic of colonial distinction, for the Evolué, the three-piece suit was both garb of power and straitjacket. I argue that we can only understand Lumumba's anti-colonial struggle and the contradictory actions and views of other key protagonists if we look more closely at their shared backstory. To put it in a nutshell, my book is not another history of Patrice Lumumba, but rather the story of his generation, the Lumumba Generation.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for this elevator pitch. I think if we would have been in a normal room, I would have applauded, but I don't know how to do this. But thanks for that. In the meantime, I see in the chat that several that's comments that at least Patrick Hege also writes he wished he would have had written this book. So I'm counting now, and I will give you feedback at the end of the evening of how many of them had wished that. And Ngozi, do you want to go next and give a comment on either on Daniel's speech or on the book itself?
I just need a second to stand up so that it's more comfortable for me. So I just have 5 minutes. So I have my notes so that I don't run over time. So I'm very delighted to share a few words on this excellent book as one who will be standing on the shoulders of a new giant in the fields of African and global history. So the Lumumba Generation begins with deceit, the description of a soon-to-be-seen photograph intended to pull us into the world of a perfect elite family. Instead, this picture exposed glaring contradictions and paradoxes of exclusionary inclusions, unequal equalities, and uncollaborative collaborators. Thus, from an outstanding array of Belgian, English, German, and French sources, Daniel weaves a compelling story about how the colonial state sought to create bourgeoisies from its own bourgeoisification and to moralize this group from its own moralization. Thus, this work joins an increasing body of literature on the formation of the African elite, or in this case, the Evolué, a small but elite group of educated Congolese men in the 1940s and 1950s. Yet the manner in which the Belgian colonial state dealt with the idea of its African elite differed from the British and French ideal. This is particularly so in the idea of how the Evolué were to be produced and what their legal rights would be. Furthermore, this minority class, keen to gain the Evolué status, in contradiction became nationalists. At the center of the process of elite formation was the print media and its poster child, Voix du Congolais, a propagandist elite newspaper, self-styled by Congolese for Congolese. Yet despite attempts by the state to immunize the Evolué against anti-colonial and communist ideas, and thus produce pious intermediary loyalists, the newspaper became an important anti-colonial platform. But what is fascinating for me about the book is that it often draws comparisons to the British, French, and Portuguese colonies. And so I'll draw some comparisons of my own between colonial Nigeria, the focus of my own research, and the Belgian Congo in this book. So similar to colonial Nigeria, newspapers like the Voix du Congolais drew attention to grievances and were channels for colonial reform. Furthermore, like colonial Nigeria, the undue focus by the Belgian colonial press in general on the elections and political parties ultimately, as Daniel argues, and I quote, intensified the fragmentation of the educated elite. But in contrast, the colonial Nigerian press was almost exclusively in African hands, and so enjoyed relatively greater freedom. Thus, for instance, the West African Pilot, the most widely circulating and best-selling newspaper in the colony in the 1940s, could develop its own voice, even though it was not immediately nationalist. But in the Belgian case, the press was controlled by the competing and controlling interests of the church and state, with undesirable criticisms of the Belgian colonial authorities in the Voix du Congolais potentially leading to severe punishment. So naturally, the Evolué often towed the official line and acted as the official echo chamber of the elite. Yet we also see how they negotiated these censored spaces with a little divergence from the norm, triggering a nationalist response. The second difference is that in colonial Nigeria, gender, literacy in a colonial language, or superior education could not exclude the predominantly non-elite from interacting with the elite newspaper culture. This is glaring in the case of the West African pilot, where the elite and non-elite coexisted and engaged in conversation. In contrast, in the Belgian Congo, sharp demarcations were kept between the civilized and uncivilized, even in person, where interactions between the two communities were equally verboten or heavily regulated. So in conclusion, this work ends in the same way it began, with the first picture. Viewed through the critical eyes of the sun, of the evolué found in the center of our gaze, we are reminded of what Daniel's book has been telling us from page 1 about perfectibility, performances, and patchy personalities. In sum, and I quote, elite formation was meant to prevent the formation of an elite. Thank you.
Thank you, Ngozi, also raising the importance of the pictures in the book, a point that has been raised before. Emery, do you want to go next? Give us your thoughts.
Thank you, Joël. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, the publisher, for inviting me. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to make 4 comments. I mean, as a way of, my appreciation of the book. So because I believe that this is a celebration of, an important book on Central Africa and global history as a whole. So my comment, somehow is an assessment, of the book. So first, the argument, so for me, is very, very interesting. So Daniel shows another reading of this, social category. So for me, it's a positive reading of the evolution, because so far they've always been seen as, traitors. So I know it doesn't, in the book, it doesn't go, that way, but what I see here is the way in which, disciplinary and sovereign powers, work in a context of a colonial state. So what is interesting here as well is the obsession by the colonial state to discipline and produce, different forms of indisciplines, which in turn becomes, suicidal to the state. And I think that's very, very interesting as well, because it also, open up all the question of, the kind of sadism in which we can read through, Sartre and so forth. So I would say that we're not here in the mode of, or kind of analysis based on the, dichotomy between oppression and resistance. But Daniel is going beyond that, breaking that, mode of thinking. So, and then you have this idea of, power over death and life, but here it's not about killing bodies, but it's mainly about killing culture. So not only that the state is capable of killing people's culture and replace it with something else, it can also kill or, defer, people's aspirations. I think this is very interesting because it leads to the theme of what Daniel described so beautifully in the book, what we can term as temporalities of change. And in the book, it speaks about, developmental colonialism. So control of the pace of change, which then, linked to the question of future past. I guess you can see the influence of Renal Kozelek here as well. With the horizons of expectation. So in the way Daniel describes it, what we can see here is, the conclusion could be that the colonial state was, I mean, at some point stupid. So you see some form of stupidity here, if we can make that kind of judgment. So in a sense, the state is not aware that the contingency of action exists, meaning that indetermination is part of human action. So the next point I want to make is, I mean, the mode of analysis that Daniel deploys, which has to do with, I mean, the way he thinks about metropole and the colony in an entangled relationship, because most of the time this has been thought, separately, especially when it comes to the Congo and Belgium. So we have these three registers of analysis, which shows how historians can write both conceptually and empirically. The third point, I mean, the title itself, so, generation, moving away from, individuals. I mean, Lumumba, I mean, there's been a lot of, work on Lumumba, but it chose to focus on a generation entirely. That I find it very, very refreshing. So, and then there's also a shift from politics to culture. And I think the last point, which I think is the major contribution of this book, especially in relation to the historiography of the Congo and Belgium, is Daniel's framing of the book in relation to bourgeoisie theory. So to conclude, I think all in all, this is a great book. It's very well researched and very well written. It takes up, beautifully Nancy's Rose and challenge in her essay titled "History as Form," that history implies experimentation with craft, theory, shapes, and granularity. So I hope there will be a French translation, for I mean, the people who can't access it in English. So thank you for this wonderful work.
Thank you, Emery. Also calling for to the editors to think about the French translation and coining en passant the concept of the stupid colonial states. I think something to discuss here. But let's hear first Richard. Do you want to step in? Mic is off. Do you want to turn your mic on?
Okay. Okay, can you hear me now?
Thanks, great.
Yeah. It's a great privilege to be part of the beginning of this book. It's a very impressive contribution to several different kinds of historical fields. Much of what I said has been said, I'm going to say, has been said in one form or another by the two other interveners. And indeed, I begin, much as Ngozi began, with that extraordinary photograph, which I'll just show to you in the case you haven't actually had a chance to see it. I'm not sure that I'm doing this very successfully. Can people make that out?
Yeah, we see that.
Yeah, which is a photograph of a Congolese évolué home in Leopoldville in 1952. At the opening, the image is examined as an object of colonial propaganda and mined to explore the contradictions of the social group. By the end, though, we understand that it was the result of a careful performance of a westernized domestic habitus by people who were engaged in a struggle for rights to civic participation, in which this performance was an important ritual. Now, it's not just that the document and the moment it records can be read from many perspectives. We're reminded of how slippery the central object of this book is, the problem of évolué, which is something which is being constituted from several different directions at the same time. And the importance and success of this important book is that it not only offers a sophisticated portrait of Belgian colonialism and of the politics of the Congo in the 20th century, Tödt also offers us a masterclass in how the tools of social and cultural history can be brought together to make sense of status identities, which are being constituted from the outside and the inside at the same time. It is to this extent a contribution to a global historical sociology from an African historical perspective. At the heart of the Lumumba generation is the problem of how a figure like Lumumba could journey from being the young man who wrote essays in praise of Stanley and the Belgian civilizing mission into being, at the moment of independence, the scourge of the violence and despotism of the Belgian colonial order. It charts through a sophisticated examination of newspapers, associations, Belgian colonial policy, especially after 1945, and Congolese responses to it, how a small intermediate group operated first as agents of the colonial state, and then as its disappointed critics and ultimately enemies. They were shaped by the central contradiction of colonial rule, and this was a contradiction which applied not just in the Belgian Empire. Its attempt to create indigenous collaborators without creating a group which would demand civic and economic equality. For the Belgians, this took an extreme form. They did not envision creating, except as exceptions, Black Belgians. They did not seek to bring the colonized to Belgian universities, or even to allow them free rights of migration to the colonial power. Compare this to especially France, but also to Britain, where groups like Césaire et al.'s Légitime Défense or Padmore's International African Service Bureau were able to organize anti-colonial sentiment and politics from the imperial center. There's much here to learn about the peculiarities of Belgian imperialism. In particular, for me, the forms which its program of social engineering took. It is well known, for example, that the Belgian Congo had extremely few university graduates at the moment of the end of colonial rule. But Daniel reminds us that they had, in fact, a far more successful primary school system than many parts of French West Africa. And they had these extraordinary rituals of surveillance and examination, which were connected to granting formal documents which certified that one was part of this intermediate group, no longer an indigène, even if not quite someone who was white. Tödt makes sense of this group as a species of bourgeoisie. Now, there are certainly people of the bourg, the town, but from other perspectives, they're quite anomalous. And a Marxist of a certain kind might raise the critical question. This is not a group defined by the relations of production. They do not derive their wealth from rent, profit, and interests, or their social interest and power from capital. And indeed, this is not a bourgeoisie in a strict economic sense. They are a Mittelstand, which derives its interest, power, and social location from their relationship to the colonial state, from their performance of a particular repertoire of Western cultural behaviors, and from their role in mediation. Now, part of me wondered whether thinking of them as a caste, rather than as a social class, might have been a productive supplement or alternative. For their social meaning has to do with how they're constituted as a status group relative to Europeans and those deemed as indigènes. But I was persuaded in the end, and of course I would be, given the essay which Daniel very kindly referred to, that what was being constituted in them were forms of social capital, enough to justify the appeal to the register of the bourgeoisie. But this did raise for me the question of whether in our social analysis, we need to think, both in colonial and metropolitan spaces, of how state power, which particularly in the colonial context is racialized state power, is enmeshed with economic orders, such that the operation of class and status needs always to be measured from both directions. In other words, what I'm kind of playing with here is whether we need to not just think of racial capitalism per Cedric Robinson, but racial state capitalism, where forms of racialized participation in civic rights and subordination is connected to different articulations relative to state power and to the economic and social order. So racial state capitalism as a kind of construct which is being organized. Arguments about the mediating groups in European colonialism have, of course, a long history. Within the literature of British imperialism, the so-called Cambridge School of Indian History, although remember Chris Bailey kept some distance from it, sought to understand Indian nationalism in the 1960s and 70s as the result of disappointed collaborators. Ronald Robinson in the 1970s, as Daniel notes, took out the principle here in his famous essay on collaboration. In the Portuguese Empire, Alexander Keys has similarly examined the role of assimilados in the functioning and disruption of that system. Now, in the 1960s, of course, Fanon, who is partly mentioned by Daniel, and Amilcar Cabral and Walter Rodney, who are not, examined the problem of these social classes and their contradictions from a radical anti-colonial perspective. But Tödt, I think, brings something quite different. His intelligence and compassionate attention as a historian is always sensitive to the predicament of these Congolese, how their options, cultural and political, were always being constrained by the forms of violence and indeed structural violence of Belgian colonialism. And his achievement, one of the highest of the historian, is to rescue the heroism of, which can even be survival as a form of heroism too, to rescue the heroism of forgotten or ignored figures from, in E.P. Thompson's phrase, the condescension of posterity. The Lumumba Generation is not just a major contribution to the social history of Africa and to a global social history. It is a fine example of the craft of the historian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. All right, so we went from the stupid colonial state to racial state capitalism. So another perspective on the book. Daniel, do you want to answer to that, or do you want to think about that and open the floor for questions? I think the chat or the list of participants to this event reads like who is who of Congolese and African history. I recognize several names, even with my very little knowledge of Congolese history. I recognize several names of people who might have questions on the book and to the discussants as well. So we're very happy to hear your voices or to read questions from the chat to the author if you have, or broader questions on racial state capitalism. That is, as far as I know, not a concept that is in the book, even if the concept bourgeoisie is key in the book, in the question whether it's an economic bourgeoisie or it's not an economic bourgeoisie is of importance.
I am totally thrilled by these comments, and I think the good thing about this hybrid format we have today is that we could discuss the stupid colonial state, but also the racial state capitalism over wine, so after the Zoom session. So I would rather suggest that we open up the floor and see if there are any comments or questions. And once again, I'm really happy about your reading of the book and also your comments and insights on it. And I thought that with this book, I have said everything on the issue, but I might reconsider it. But please first some comments from the other participants.
Yeah, see, Herbert Weiss raised his hand, and if he unmutes himself, he should be able to talk.
Well, as some of you may know, I am of a very, very, very different generation than all of you. The advantage I have is that I first went to the Congo, to be precise, in November, December 1959, and precisely studied the independence struggle. I kind of liked the idea that you call Belgian colonial rule stupid at that particular moment, although earlier it was quite effective. So I think how we judge Belgian colonial rule very much depends on what 5-10 year period you're talking about. Certainly, for me, the blindness of the system was made very apparent when French Equatorial Africa named a black man as the Governor General of all of French Equatorial Africa, Eboué, while in the Congo, you could not become a territorial administrator if you were black, if you were Congolese. Whatever they thought they were doing with a powerful neighbor controlling 4 territories that have since become 4 independent countries, just a canoe drive across the river that had such a different system should have opened people's eyes to the impossibility of perpetuating this system. In fact, Lumumba, since you mentioned Lumumba, since it's about Lumumba, writes about that. When he goes to Brazzaville and a white woman serves him, I think, lemonade or some whatever. So it is a stupid system towards the end. And they anticipated absolutely nothing that really happened, including the terrible shock when Lumumba stood up at the independence transfer of power celebration, when he wasn't supposed to, according to, did they really think nobody was going to, at that symbolic moment? But apparently they even had foreknowledge of that and changed nothing in what they said, what Baudouin said. Talk of stupid.
Right.
So there's that. I'll finish by saying this. You are, in the last analysis, dealing with a struggle, an independent struggle. What I miss in your summary, and of course I haven't read your book, I apologize for that, but is the link with the masses. If you know my work, you know that that is what I've sort of focused on, and I wish there were more people who picked up that theme, because it seems to me that is the link with the present.
All right, thanks.
I'll shut up from now on.
Thanks. Daniel, do you want to answer directly to that or say something about the masses?
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for the comment and also for the question regarding the masses. And of course, this book is focusing on the Congolese elite. But what I tried in my work was also to figure out the relation between the elite and the masses. And on the one hand, how it was conceived by the colonial state, what is desirable, what kind of link to the masses, but also the agency of the elite when it comes to communicating with the so-called masses. And it's interestingly enough, I found, for example, anthropology research in Stanleyville on how workers, ordinary workers, one could say, were kind of doing kind of mimicry of this elite culture. And so it was interesting to see in what way this rather elite bourgeois culture also trickled down to a certain extent. And it goes without saying that the turning point also in the decolonization of Belgian Congo was, of course, the riots in Leopoldville, which was, in fact, of course, triggered through a political manifestation, but was really a phenomenon of the urban masses. So I hope you take time to read like the last chapter maybe of the book, which deals with this kind of 59, 1960 moment. Yeah, let's hope some people pick up this perspective on the masses after me. Thank you.
All right, there's a question in the chat that I can read aloud. Daniel, congrats on the volume. On a great volume. I look forward to reading it. Here's my questions. The Lumumba generation was quite a young generation. Do you see that, Daniel? Does this youthocracy, especially because the Lumumba generation has to contend with veteran Belgian politicians, officials, and activists, account for the failure of independence? So the age gap between the Belgian and the youth in Congo.
I mean, I think if we see the people who were sitting at the table ronde in Brussels, where the discussion about the political independence was discussed, I think it was a group of Congolese with different ages. So some of them were also in their 50s. But of course, the generation of Lumumba himself, who were in their 30s, were rather young political newcomers, one could say. And of course, they had to confront a more experienced group of Belgian politicians. But this was not always an advantage for Belgium. For example, they did not think that they would leave the round table discussion with promising independence so early. So somehow I think they were also underestimated by the more experienced Belgian politician, because maybe they felt too safe in the discussions. But I think it's an interesting question, because the governments of the post-colonial Congo, especially the first years, changed a lot. And there were also many young students later involved in some of the governments. But I think this is something which is rather also where answers could be rather found in works such as, I think, Emery, Kalema, you're working on now, about young students, Congolese students in Brussels, but also especially the work of Pedro Monaville, who supported me much in Kinshasa and until now, and who's also here on Zoom, and his book on the Congolese student movement, also in the 60s, will tell a lot about these kind of questions.
All right, I see there is someone wrote question if from Didier Gondola, but I don't see the rest. So Didier, if you have a question, you might raise your hand or put it in the chat. There's a question by Kasongo Kapanga, an instructor in literature, writing, thank you, Daniel, for your book, which unfortunately I have not read, but I will do so far as I will be able to. I know a little bit about the period you studied. You talk about Congolese bourgeoisie. Could you give us a sense of its size vis-a-vis the whole Congolese population? So the question of the demographics here. Do you have an idea about the size?
It's a tricky question, actually. So social historians would maybe chase me, because the numbers are kind of slippery, especially when it comes to Congolese society. But I mean, when it comes to numbers, and especially talking about the so-called évolué elite, who also gained a special legal status, which was meager in the benefits, but very, very hard to attain. These were just a couple of thousands. So we then speak of maybe 4,000 or 5,000 people who then somehow have a certain elite status, who came close to it. And otherwise, it was a whole discussion also on the historical actors in the field, who were like asking themselves, how big is this group of évolué? And so some were arguing in the end of 40s that it's like 40,000. Others say we should include also all the wage laborers, and then we would have a much higher number. So it's very, very hard to figure out how many people should be included in this group. And mostly people were seen as part of the évolué group when they finished their secondary education or worked in the administration for enterprises, or also as primary teachers. So, but we talk about a very, very tiny group of Congolese.
Maybe to go back to Didier Gondola's question on the youthocracy, which is in stark contrast with what you have now in Congo. You have a generation which in fact came to power in a younger age in comparison to today's elites in Congo, or at least I mean, not the intellectual elite, but at least people in position of power. So do you still see a specificity of the way that the power was enforced just after the independence, due to the relative use of this generation, of what you call the Lumumba generation?
Sorry, Joël, I was lost in the chat because I tried to to find this question in the chat. So I was sorry. This
no, it was not directly in the chat, but I was thinking of today's Congolese elites, you know, which is quite old, the elite in power. And it's not only the case in Congo, but it's the case if you look at Togo, if you look at Cameroon and other countries. The elite in power and the word gerontocracy is quite often used to point to the gap between the relative use of the population and the age of the people in place in power. Was it different in the early 60s, or is it something which has a longer history?
I'm just defending myself that, you know, the book is like then ending with the early independence. So so the analysis doesn't go much further. So I won't consider myself an expert on how the Congolese politics then developed since. But of course, there's a great discrepancies between the first governments in the Congo and what we see nowadays, and also in other African states where people cling to their power, and maybe the younger generation are then the sons of the former presidents who then come to power. So I think this is something which is much more political power. This is kind of inherited, but where the, I would say the new politicians in the field are not coming from the kind of grassroots movement. And I would also say that, for example, the younger generation that also then form part of the new government, it's not like typical political institution they come from, but they rather entered the government by some professional experience they gained, and then later in the early 60s also from the few people who earned their academic degree, who then directly took over positions in the government. So it was a much shorter step into political power in the end of colonial rule and in the early years. But maybe if people in the public has a better answer, then please go ahead. I'm surrounded here by experts in the field.
I see no more urgent question here. And I also, I mean, if there is an urgent question, do not hesitate, or intervention. I also know that Andreas Eckert must be impatient to invite you for a drink, because just landing from Canada and probably looking forward to share this with you. But if I had a book, I will show the book. I didn't receive the book yet, so all right, okay, it looks actually quite brilliant. I only had the PDF in the hands, but it looks quite good, and wow. Thanks, Richard and Ngozi. Otherwise, I will thank you all very much for coming, for joining us, and thank very much Emery, Ngozi, and Richard, and Rabea for doing that. And congratulations again, Daniel, for this book and for this discussion. And we wish your book the best face it can have, which is discussion, good conversations, and controversies. And have a good evening in rework or otherwise. Thank you very much, and bye to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining. Thank you, everybody.